Shidiak Foundation in Beirut, Lebanon. Welcome to our panelists. Welcome to everybody who's watching this segment. The headline of this panel discussion is Meet the Proxies. Proxies have long been a part of the Middle East landscape, but during the past decade or so, they've risen to unprecedented levels of activity. So, who are these proxies? What do they represent? What agendas or whose agendas do they follow? What effects are they having in the Middle East today? How is Europe responding to proxy activities, especially in the wake of the Beirut explosion early in August, which led to direct involvement through President Emmanuel Macron and is still going on and suffering difficulties? And what about the United States policy under President Donald Trump's White House? How is that playing out as America piles more pressure on Hezbollah, a sworn enemy of Israel, at the same time as new peace agreements are forged between Israel, the UAE, and Bahrain? Well, to help us answer these questions and many more, and to discuss the wider implications of it all, I'm joined by a distinguished panel of guests indeed. Robert Danin is a senior fellow with the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center, a former State Department and White House official. Robert has served in every US administration from Ronald Reagan to Barack Obama, so that puts him very much in my generation. And he specialized in the Middle East for most of his professional career, also, like me, as a journalist. Tom Fletcher is the principal of Hertford College, Oxford. He was ambassador to Lebanon from 2011 to 2015. His best-selling book, Naked Diplomacy, Power and Statecraft in the Digital Age, was turned into a virtual masterclass for diplomats worldwide. Sven Koopmans is a Dutch MP for the People's Party for Freedom and Democracy. He served as a diplomat in Kosovo, Mali, Sudan, the United States, and Belgium. Back in 2008, while stationed in Pristina, Kosovo, Sven survived a bomb attack on his office. Last but not least, we also have a very warm welcome to Paul Salem, who is president of the Middle East Institute. Paul is an expert in the region. We've known each other for a long time, with all due diligence, and he was often a valued commentator and analyst during my time as CNN's Beirut bureau chief in Lebanon. So let's get the ball rolling, please, gentlemen, and I'll come first of all to you, Paul. Who are the main proxies we're going to be talking about today, do you think? The most relevant ones, the most active ones, and the ones that are really involved in some of the top policy-making decisions in the Middle East today?
Well, when we look at the Middle East, there certainly are a large number of proxies. Some of them are sort of very organized under government authority, and that would refer mainly to the proxies that are connected to Iran. But we also have a large number of armed non-state actors in general, which might have their own autonomous provenance and reality, but then end up being backed by one group or another. All of this is relevant because you can only have proxies if you have failed states. Once a state has failed, then you can have militias either rise up naturally, or you can build a militia in a failed state, and that militia can behave as a proxy for other people. In the case of the Middle East, obviously Lebanon has had proxy forces for a long time. It was a failed state from 1975 and 1990 and continues somewhat as a failed state. When Iraq failed or partially failed, there too you had proxies. When Syria failed, you had proxies. Now you have proxies after Libya failed, and certainly after Yemen failed as well. I would say that in the region, Iran certainly has a proud and ideologically and politically organized philosophy or strategic posture of having expeditionary forces in third countries. They're very proud of the presence of Hezbollah in Lebanon. They're very proud of their support for the Houthis in Yemen, militias in Iraq and Syria, and they believe that's part of a legitimate advanced strategy against threats from the US or from Israel or from others. Other players like Turkey have also gotten into the game, as we see in Libya. The UAE and Egypt have also gotten into the game. The US on and off has been in the proxy game when they supported the Mujahideen in Afghanistan or provided support for other groups in the Middle East or Latin America or so on. I think, I mean, the issue of proxies relates systemically to the collapse of states in the Middle East, and it relates systemically to two main conflict axes in the Middle East. One conflict axis is that between Iran and several players, Iran, US, Iran, Israel, Iran, Gulf. And there's a bunch of proxies involved in that conflict. And the second sort of systemic conflict which has proxies involved in it is the, if you might say, intra-Sunni state conflict, where you have Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, and Egypt on one side, Qatar and Turkey on the other, and they support different proxies in Turkey. In Libya, Turkey backs some proxies in Syria, and so on. So I'll just start with that.
So Tom, let me come over to you. You as a former career diplomat, ambassador to Lebanon. I don't think there's much point naming all the proxies, but who do you see as the most influential players in the proxy field today?
Well, yeah, well, it's great to be here. Thank you very much. And I'm actually, yes, I'm now a recovering ambassador, a recovering diplomat. And I think, I mean, Paul's given us a fantastic comprehensive sense of quite how complex this picture is. And that was very much the case while I was in Lebanon 5 years ago. It will very much be the case in Lebanon, I fear, in the future, because as long as that failed state persists, as Paul has described, the ground is very fertile for these kinds of groups. I think it's quite important, though, as part of this conversation, that we do recognize that this external interference in Lebanon is not a 21st century phenomenon. And I say that with all humility as a former representative of the British government. You know, we've all been interfering in Lebanon for decades, maybe centuries. I remember once sitting with one of the Lebanese leaders who said to me, "We need your help because you helped us last time round as the UK." And I said, "Did we really?" Thinking back maybe 5 or 10 years. And he said, "Yeah, in 1861, you were on our side." And so we have to remember that actually for many Lebanese, there is this perception that you can't actually survive without that sort of external backing. And this often becomes an alibi, an excuse actually for not taking action that needs taking, but often it is very justified as an explanation of why Lebanon can't get out of this fix that it finds itself in. You know, that Oscar Wilde line when he says, "It's not paranoia when everyone's really out to get you." And I think the Lebanese often feel that is the case. And actually, independence won't be possible, truly, for Lebanon until they find some sort of way of freeing themselves from that dependence on this outside interference. I think, as Paul has said, I mean, the most significant, and many of us would say more malign, interference in Lebanon at the moment is from Iran. One regret I have when I look back on that period, 2011 to 2015, when I was there, we created the International Support Group, which was really meant to throw a protective ring around Lebanon and say, in the context of the Syria war, we may all be arguing and fighting across the border, but we do all agree that we need to preserve Lebanon's stability. We didn't say perhaps enough about Lebanon's reform at the time. But one crucial country, important country with influence in Lebanon was missing from that conversation. And that was, of course, Iran. And maybe we would never have convinced Iran to behave differently, but we never found a way, I don't think, to have that conversation about Lebanese stability and ultimately reform and ultimately independence with Tehran as well as with the other capitals of the region.
But it's true to say, isn't it, Tom, if I can stick with you a little longer, that the nature of the beast, if you like, the proxy relationship with sponsors, national sponsors, is a transactional one. They both use each other. So in terms of US history, it's not uncommon for proxies that have been fighting or allied with US interests in different parts of the world are dropped. The Kurds come to mind most recently, the drawdown of US troops by Trump at the end of last year. So both sides know when they go into this that it could be a short-lived or medium term, not a forever arrangement.
Yes, true. And yet one thing that all of these forms of proxy conflict have in common is that ultimately none of them seem to actually work. And you know, one reflection watching the Middle East over the last few decades from different embassies and different positions in the UK system is that the periods when you intervene in the Middle East, it bites you back. The periods when you don't intervene in the Middle East, it bites you back. And the periods when you swing in and swing out, doing this sort of diplomatic hokey-cokey, it also bites you back. And so there isn't a magic answer to this. There isn't an easy fix.
Let me switch to Robert now, because it's a very good segue for that. Thanks, Tom. In terms of hokey-cokeying in and out of conflicts, interesting way of putting it. Thank you, Tom. But I take the point. If you go back to Nicaragua, the Contras, if we go back in history, the US has had a pretty consistent relationship with proxies across the decades, hasn't it?
Well, I might actually embrace, Tom's idea about sort of the hokey pokey. I mean, you've seen periods where you have heightened American activism, American power projection in the region. What I think we're seeing now is a period of retrenchment that started with the Obama administration and is actually continued with the Trump administration. And so at the macro level, what this administration is trying to do is actually pull America back from involvement in every corner of the region and extricate the United States from active engagement in all of these proxy wars. And in doing so, it's trying to empower allies in the region, maybe analogous to what Nixon tried to do with key allies in the region, be it the Gulf Arabs, be it Egypt, be it Israel. And at the same time, to the extent that it is continuing to fight proxy wars, we've seen a shift, or at least an emphasis. Whereas if the Obama administration, that the weapon of choice was drones, what we're seeing now is the use of economic warfare and sanctions as perhaps the strongest tool that the U.S. is employing. But I think we're also seeing another shift, which is that rather than fight the proxies in each battle field around the region, we're seeing a move to take it to the heart, which is to the center. And so, as a result, the focus is on Iran and confronting Iran in Iran, and less so directly through proxies. And so I think the problem, or one of the problems that is derivative of such an approach, is that it tends to treat regional conflicts or local conflicts wholly within a prism of a larger conflict. And I think that's what we're seeing to a certain extent in Lebanon. So for example, as Jeff Feltman said in this forum 2 days ago, the administration doesn't really have a clear and coherent Lebanon policy. It has a regional policy to confront Iran and to put maximum pressure on Iran. And to the extent that plays out in Lebanon vis-a-vis Hezbollah, it does. But in terms of a national strategy towards towards Lebanon, or a strategy towards Lebanon as such, I think it is subordinate to a larger conflict with Iran, and yeah, that's where we are.
If I can just follow up on that, I think you made a very important point on the economic, if you like, siege that is being put in place. It's determined to weaken Iran, obviously, but at the same time, collateral damage against Iran's proxy Hezbollah at the expense of the country Lebanon at large. So do you think that in terms of projecting American power, using American policy to shape its agenda, that I wouldn't say the abandonment, but a shift, if you like, a pivot to economic warfare is being proved to be successful or a favor in what's going on in Lebanon today?
Well, I think it depends by what metric you want to use. I think that for the administration, the economic sanctions and the use of the dollar as the currency of the international currency is one that has a very big impact in the region and on a number of players, and we're seeing that you in Lebanon are feeling that impact quite directly. But it's pretty relatively low cost for the United States. I mean, the consequences of such an approach, really, of designating individuals, banning those who terrorist groups and those who do economic commerce with them from the international banking system or from dollar accounts. I mean, the consequences of the United States are quite minimal, and so it's very attractive in that regard. You know, because it is high impact and low cost. And I think, you know, the assessment is, and it's very hard to get at, but you know, the pressure that the maximum pressure that campaign has been waged against Iran has had impact and has really hurt the Iranian people, and it's hurt Iran as a country. It has not produced the desired outcome in the sense that it has not brought the Iranians to the table as the administration claims that it wants, nor has it brought about regime change, as some suspect is the real objective of the administration. But in either case, the administration thinks, I think, that Iran is weaker, sees it on the retreat somewhat in certain areas, and is, as we've heard from President Trump, he's, you know, of the mind that if he wins the election, the Iranians will come crawling to the negotiating table within a month.
Sven Koopmans, let me take the European perspective of what Robert's been telling us, and Tom and Paul. How do you think that in the Middle East, Europe's largely seen as a second fiddle to US activities in the region? But how do you see it from there, from Europe itself, in terms of, you know, Germany, France, Britain, your own country, Netherlands, and so forth? Do you agree with what Robert was saying there? Do you have any areas where you diverge in terms of attitude and behavior, policy towards Iran and the use of these proxies?
Well, I agree with you, Brent, when you say that Europe plays a second fiddle in the proxy game, perhaps, though Europe is stepping up its game a little bit, but with fits and starts. In the Syria war, where I was involved earlier on the side of the United Nations doing the peace negotiations, you saw that various European states were actively supporting armed groups in Syria. And that actually helped to change the perspective a little bit from, say, more pacifist countries such as my own, the Netherlands, because proxies in this war were sometimes seen as the good guys. You know, we were to see them as the bad guys, and only the evil Americans perhaps were supporting them in Nicaragua or where else. Europe was stepping up its game, but now I find we are retreating a bit again, because we've seen that also the nice proxies can do awful things. And we have a very hard time accepting responsibility for that. At the same time, on the issue of fighting proxies, we discussed Iran just now. We are also caught a bit in the middle, because, of course, in Europe also Hezbollah is designated a terrorist organization. We want it out. To deal with it, we need to deal with Iran, but we also have an interest in getting the nuclear deal with Iran still holding. The broad brush American approach there is perhaps undermining us dealing with that, while at the same time it doesn't seem to help very much dealing with Hezbollah. Europe doesn't have a good response, but to finish off perhaps, Europe is now stepping up its game on targeted sanctions against individuals, and that could be used also to target leaders of proxies in the Middle East. But can we push through? I'm not so sure.
An example of that, of course, is President Macron's initiative in Lebanon post the Beirut blast at the beginning of last month. It seemed to me that KSA, Saudi Arabia, was very quiet about that. I didn't see a great deal of pro-comment about it. In fact, I would argue that there was perhaps an interest in KSA to see that initiative fail. I also think from the way that the Hezbollah allies in Lebanon have today dug in deeper in terms of government formation apropos the Macron plan, that both sides are digging in deeper as far as Lebanon's concerned. But I wonder, you know, when Macron went and walked around the rubble of Beirut, I didn't hear much echoing, much resonance throughout Europe. General words of support for emergency relief, much of which, of course, hasn't gone in terms of financial support for reasons that are obvious in terms of the fact there's no government, not least where that money might go. So I ask you really, why was there no further support for Macron? Was it seen as a lost leader in the first place?
I think you will know that European foreign policy is something that is slowly developing, but is so far still overtaken by national initiatives. And I would say, from where I am now in Dutch Parliament, I would say sometimes that is a good thing. Now, President Macron is dealing with Lebanon as a historic partner of France, and he has his own ambitions. I do not think he has great interest to set up a pan-European plan for Lebanon. He may be interested in having humanitarian aid supported by the European Union. Certainly, we will all support that. But I think we should avoid Europeanizing things that are really national, and perhaps that is the only way that it can serve. And I don't know nearly enough of Lebanese politics, certainly not as much as those around at the table here. But I would say that France is perhaps a better place to know the nuances and deal with them than if you put it into a Brussels committee.
Tom Fletcher, let me circle back to you. If we look at the proxies that are fighting involved in Iraq, in Syria, and in Lebanon today, in terms of their sponsors, who's winning, who's losing?
That's a good question. Can I just come in very briefly on the Macron point? And this may be counterintuitive coming from a former British ambassador, but actually I think Macron did something very important with that initiative, which was actually just to show empathy, literally put his arms around the Lebanese people. And that was very necessary at that time. So setting apart the more Machiavellian motives that everyone assumes in the Middle East, especially when the Brits or the French get involved, that was an important gesture. And there was an important effort to speak some truth to power in Lebanon as well. I think where it maybe went a bit more astray is in talking about a new pact, for example. Never think that you can fix Lebanon as an outsider. Our great challenge, to come more to your point, with all of these across the Middle East where the proxies have run rampant, is once you've worked to remove the sponsors of those proxies, to try and reduce their ability to manipulate the region, what do you then fall back on? You hope that you fall back on local leadership. And I got into trouble once in Lebanon for saying we needed a new Sykes-Picot. What I didn't mean was that you needed new external powers carving up the region, but that you needed local leadership to work out the answers to the Middle East's problems. But that leadership doesn't just turn up overnight. We all know it's there. We should never fall for this mistaken view that leadership doesn't exist in the Middle East. But it's very, as we've seen in Iraq and Afghanistan and across the region, you can't expect that leadership just to emerge overnight once you create the space for it. So who else can then help to fill that vacuum, almost to hold the ring in the meantime? Well, in normal circumstances, you would look to America over the last 20, 30 years. These are very clearly not normal circumstances in Washington. You have a president determined to prove his critics right, and who is more likely to pour oil on the fires of the Middle East, whereas previous presidents at least tried to put some of them out. So who else do you look to? I would suggest that a number of the key, what we might have regarded as, certainly the permanent members of the Security Council are either quite distracted, and probably Britain and France fall into that category, or have a very different agenda. I'd put Russia and Putin in that category. So where else do you go when you have an international system which is quite orphaned at the moment? Now, at times in Lebanon, we then look to the UN to fill that space. The UN, as we all know, in its 75th year is effectively orphaned by the Trump administration and is lacking resource and mojo, to be honest. Very difficult for them to fill that space. So as a result, the proxies do get more freedom of maneuver than anyone would want. Now, I think, to come very specifically to your question, a year ago, you pretty much heard Tehran claiming victory. You heard this sort of briefing coming out that we now control 4 capitals or 5 capitals. It was always changing. I don't hear that as much 1 year on. So I would suggest that no one is winning. So
hedging your bets. Okay, Paul, I'm going to go and try and wiggle something out of you now, because it's my view that as things stand now, and I don't want this debate to be all about Lebanon, but inevitably I guess it will be, given that some of our panelists. But do you go along with what Tom is saying there, that it's even? I see that Iran's grip today, they're showing, okay, the financial sanctions, of course, are affecting Iran, but I don't see them blinking.
That's correct. They're not blinking. They're maybe more impoverished than they were a couple of years ago because of the maximum pressure campaign, but that has not changed their presence in the region. It has caused them, you know, Tom mentioned the example of Oscar Wilde and the Paranoiac. The Iranians are convinced that everybody is out to get them, and the Trump administration has helped reinforce that, and they just dig in deeper. The brief version of it is that Iran, you know, as a regional power, is the dominant player in Iraq and in Syria and in Lebanon and in at least half of Yemen. That presence is not been shaken. They are not going to give any of that up. Even if there is a Biden administration, they might negotiate on nuclear issues. They might even negotiate with the second Trump administration on nuclear clauses. But their mini empire, you know, dilapidated and devastated as it is, they view it as essential because they still believe that the United States in the long term is out for regime change. Partly they actually believe that's true, partly that's baked in to the Islamic Republic's raison d'etre and ideological attitude towards its own people. They are convinced of even more than that vis-a-vis Israel, so they will not give up Hezbollah or their presence in Syria or Iran. So I would say yes, they are in a very long-term, fairly dominant position in these countries. What's interesting is that, you know, what's been emerging over the last few weeks is a consolidation of a Gulf Israeli axis, which was sort of, you know, being whispered about and being done behind closed doors, and has come out in the open as a major partnership, which will effectively be also a strategic and security and intelligence alliance. And that really consolidates, maybe in a bad way, two violently opposed axes in the Middle East. And as I mentioned, there's another third hard axis. Iran supports sort of more Shiite political Islam. Turkey and Qatar support Sunni political Islam. That axis is hardening as well, and has its own militia forces and digging in for the long term, at least until or as long as, you know, Erdogan is president or is a going concern in Turkey. So it's a very dismaying reality for the Middle East. Rather than moving towards regional dialogue, regional order, we're moving in the opposite direction.
And how important, a short follow-up, how important is it that historically Iran's transactional relationship with its proxies is maintained? Hezbollah was formed, as you know, in the early 1980s, and exists today with large funding, weapons, resources, political support, whereas other states, you know, break their transactional agreements. So how important is that staying power, if you like, that Iran has for its allies?
Very important, and I mean, they are not exactly allies, and the relationship is not transactional. It's institutional, and it's part of, you know, Iran's doctrine, part of its organized institutionalization of all of this. So Hezbollah is officially, in a sense, part of, you know, the Islamic Revolutionary Guards network in other countries, and in meetings even with Iranian officials in the last, you know, year before COVID at least, we'd meet in Berlin or other capitals. And they say, look, our vision moving forward is that states have failed. The Iraqi army wasn't able to defend Iraq against ISIS. The Syrian army wasn't able to defend the Syrian state. the Lebanese army is not able, and so on and so forth, and that they are going to be doubling down institutionally on building ideological militias that are organized and officially part of the Iranian expeditionary, empire or force abroad, that are always on the payroll, always taken care of. So your point is exactly right, that these are not proxies that, occasionally the Iranians will help. They're on the Iranian strategic map. They're part of the payroll, whereas everybody else, take, the U.S. administration's dealings with the Kurds in Syria. They used them as long as they were useful, and then President Trump dropped them, and you see similar behavior elsewhere.
Thank you. Let's go to Robert again. You have some oversight in terms of Israel and its behavior, its policies from the U.S. optical position optics. How is Israel, which of course had its own proxy in Lebanon, the South Lebanon Army in that buffer zone in the south, which came to an end in, I think, 2000. How is Israel going to look at an Iranian relationship with Hezbollah, that Hezbollah not only is the government, is now dictating the government again as we speak, or whether one will be formed or not? How is Israel going to look at the prospect of having A, a failed state, which is Lebanon, B, Hezbollah armed with reportedly tens of thousands of rockets pointing south from Lebanon to Israel, to having a failed state with Hezbollah ruling the roost in there?
Well, before we get to that, I just want to touch on one thing that's been talked about. One problem, and this is not a criticism, but when we talk about proxies, it implies a level of control that I think is inappropriate or isn't quite precise. So that when we look at these various groups like Hezbollah, for example, it is true Iran exercises a great deal of influence, but there's a difference between influence and control. And so what the distortion that leads to is to see countries like Lebanon as Iranian controlled, which those of us who watch Lebanon and who are Lebanese understand that is a gross distortion. Yes, Iran via Hezbollah has a tremendous amount of influence, but it is not an unrivaled controller of what happens in Lebanon. And similarly, we even see, I would contest that in Syria. Iran obviously has been critical towards the continued stability, survival of the Assad regime, but so has Russia as well. And so, I think what we're seeing at a really, not to be too macro, but as the United States retrenches from the region, not retreats, but retrenches, repositions, what this has done is created various vacuums that various players step into in various contexts. And so you have different sort of ad hoc coalitions come together in Libya, in Syria, in Yemen, and it's hard to find a universal thread in it all. Some want to see Iran in all of it, and there is some truth to that, but when it comes to Libya, for example, you don't see Iranian footprints, but nor do you see American footprints right now. You see Turkey involved, you see the Emirates and Egypt and Qatar as well. So what makes this messy is this vacuum is creating different opportunities for different players, and different players are stepping into different playing fields, but not universal. So that's just a kind of macro observation about this. The problem with seeing proxies as controlled by their masters, they're influenced, and in some ways they're directed, I would say, but control sometimes overstates it and leads to distortion. And I think it leads to distortion in policy from where I'm sitting in Washington, D.C. When it comes to Israel, as an observer, I think that Iran, I think Israel, like the United States, and one of the paradoxes is, first of all, Israel is badly burned by its experience in Lebanon, and in a sense, they've internalized the lesson that Tom Fletcher pointed to, which is, no outside actor can control Lebanon, and so you have in Israel a surprising an over-learning, if you will, but a desire to not get involved at all in Lebanon in any way in terms of directing politics and trying to influence outcomes. There's a sense this is, we've tried that. This is beyond our reach, beyond our capability to understand, control. Instead, they've stated, some very clear and simple objectives. They want Hezbollah contained. They want Hezbollah not to reach a new level of technological advancement that would allow it to have not only the hundreds of, 100 to 150,000 missiles that it has, but to have the precision to then become more of a strategic, be able to target strategically within Israel. But I think from the Israelis, and especially given the high level of coordination with the United States, they as well no longer are looking at Lebanon or Hezbollah as in a silo. Instead, I think what they see is they see a northern front in which Hezbollah is not only in Lebanon, but also is in Syria and is, in Iraq and is allied with Iran. And so I think the Israelis are very reluctant to get embedded or enmeshed in another Lebanese quagmire. They really don't want that. They're willing to take on Iran. They're very reluctant to hit Hezbollah because they know that Hezbollah will retaliate. And there's a debate about within Israel. Some critics believe that Israel's their deterrence has been eroded by Hezbollah, where others argue no, that's not the case. They're just being judicious in recognizing that Hezbollah will retaliate. And so, one of the ironies is it's much easier for the Israeli military to strike and kill Iranian forces in Syria than it is for them to strike and kill Hezbollahi forces who they believe will retaliate in a way that the Iranians won't. So I think the bottom line here is that what I'm trying to say is I think the Israelis are trying to keep their powder dry because they do see Iran as the strategic focus. And they also, they don't want to be bogged down in the wrong front, be it in Lebanon. They have Hamas and other jihadist groups in Gaza, and so they recognize that that they have a number of fronts that are volatile. They have ISIS in Sinai. So they look at Lebanon as a failing state, but they actually want Macron to succeed. They want Lebanon to emerge as a successful state. You see the willingness of the Israelis to try to reach an accommodation with Lebanon about the gas fields, for example. So I think it's a misperception that the Israelis seek to destroy Hezbollah to the last Lebanese. That's not. I think what I hear from Israelis. What I hear is a frustration as to understand what tools could be effective. But they also recognize they're not a power to play there. They want others. They want the United States. They'd like, if France can do it, great. But I think they have learned the limits of their own influence there.
That takes me, thank you very much, Robert. That takes me neatly to Sven Koopmans here now. Sven, when you look at your history and experience, especially in Syria, and we talk about this melee of proxies with conflicting agendas in some cases, control, not control, financial support. It's all very messy. How do you think the international community, and we talked about from Tom, this vacuum of, if you like, of anyone who's able to do anything at such a grand scale, to be able to stitch together a multifaceted deal that can put an end to this cycle of violence and failed statehoods in the Middle East. And from a European perspective, and we've seen many peace conferences in the past being obviously involved with the European leaderships, how do you think, nothing can happen obviously until after the next US elections in November, but do you think it's time for another major effort at the international level to resolve these issues between Iran and the United States and the various players, state players, sub-state players, or do you think that's just a pipe dream?
I think we always have to try and to hope, but we have to be measured. I am not very optimistic about, as you put it, perhaps a grand bargain, a major deal. Certainly, I wouldn't argue for any big international conference with all the cameras rolling and Brent Sadler standing there interviewing all the major players, because as you put it and Robert did as well, I think you have to operate at various levels. You have to operate at the levels of the proxies, also of their sponsors, and as Robert put it, there is very rarely real control. There is influence, which means that they have separate interests, which also means that you have to put things on the table that really are tailored towards the proxies themselves and their leaders. Also because it's very hard to defeat proxies. We cannot imagine that they will be killed by whatever opponent they have, because they're so fluid. You have to look at the self-interest of their leaders. And I think we often overlook that. And we have to, when people negotiate, and like you and others have been close to many negotiations, you have to, these people who are negotiating, they think, what will my position be when we have this bargain, when we strike this deal? And that means you also have to talk about, okay, what is your position in the new power structure? But can we do that with proxies? That's a problem, particularly when we say they are terrorists. How can we strike a deal with people we consider terrorists? Are we willing to offer them a ministerial position or something like that? I think we all have to grow up, look more for the nuances. Europe certainly needs to step up its game and accept that it's a messy world. At the same time, we then need to be tough and be gentle, perhaps forgive people for their evil deeds at some point, so we can actually get them to agree to have a deal and move on.
And in that vein, you must have lamented the withdrawal from the nuclear deal by the United States administration.
Absolutely. Well, yes, we now farther off from where we were before. Iran is more likely to acquire a nuclear weapon. There doesn't seem to be any alternative. And at the same time, if the Trump administration was angry also over Iran's support for proxies in Yemen and in Lebanon and everywhere else, it hasn't actually made any gains. So I think that was just a very bad move.
Tom Fletcher, back to you, please. In terms of where we are now, if I could ask you to just to cast your vision ahead and tell me what you think about the possibility of a new war in the Middle East.
Brent, I think Tom had to leave. He had a family emergency. He mentioned that on the chat function, so I think he's no longer with us.
Okay, thanks, Paul. If you could pick that up.
Sorry, could you pitch the question again then?
Sure, yeah. Looking into your crystal ball, what are the chances, do you think, of another war breaking out in the Middle East based on what we're seeing happening in Lebanon today, what we were talking about with Robert and Israel there? How unstable is the instability of the region going to unfold, do you think?
Well, I do not expect any state-to-state war or any major war. Iran is all about deterrence, and Israel is all about deterrence, and the Gulf is all about deterrence. President Trump is not about to start a war. Turkey is, they all play in proxy wars, and those are ongoing. There is a war in Yemen, there is a war in Libya, there is a war in Syria, there is a war, lest we forget, Afghanistan. But no, I don't see any state-to-state war. But I do think that the instability will continue, and instability obviously always carries the risk of a miscalculation. There could be a miscalculation on the Israeli-Syrian border, Israeli-Lebanese border. There could be conceivably a miscalculation across the Yemeni-Saudi border or across other borders. But I really find that unlikely. It's also the case, as you yourself mentioned, the whole region is awaiting the results, if we have results, but the results of the U.S. elections, because that, in early 2021, all the players will be the same, but the American player might be very different. A first administration, Biden administration, will probably go back into the nuclear deal, revive diplomacy with Iran. I think Iran would be open at least to that process of re-engagement that will then, cast a shadow on diplomacy vis-a-vis Lebanon, vis-a-vis Iraq, and so on. So I don't think anybody's going to start anything big until they see what's about to happen. And it's interesting that all the main players in the region claim to be playing a defensive game, and yet everybody is in each, has their hand down the other person's throat, and that is the definition of a conflict track. Nobody has, it's all about their insecurities. The Islamic Republic's insecure, Israel's insecure, Saudi's insecure, Erdogan is insecure, Assad is insecure. Every Lebanese faction sees itself as a victim and a minority and insecure. So the challenge of visionary leadership, whether it comes from within the region, where it should come from, is to transform a region which is at war with itself for no good reason into a region which is secure, where states are secure, and where the focus is on cooperation, on the future, on development. God knows, and COVID reminds us that, the world is going to hell in a handbasket between COVID and climate change and artificial intelligence and unemployment and poverty. And we're busy fighting 20th century or 19th century wars with very, very backward-looking, approaches. So that's where I'd put it. I don't expect a war or a major one in the coming weeks.
Robert, do you go along with that assessment?
Well, I'm a little less sanguine, I have to say, than Paul, and it relates to something that actually Sven said. Yes, it's hard to envisage at this point any what are called war of choice right now. We don't see, any country within the region or without, lining up to initiate a war, as say the United States, launched a war of choice against Iraq in 2003, or Israel in 1982. So yes, in that sense, one doesn't see that. But unfortunately, so many of the wars in the Middle East have not been wars of choice, but have been wars of inadvertent escalation, such as 2006, which was a war that no one wanted and nonetheless we got. So when we see so much violence in these proxy wars, when we see such a small margin for error in what's happening in Syria, where you have so many armed forces fighting one another, the room for mistakes and inadvertent escalation, I think, makes it a very volatile region. And so I pray Paul is right, but I fear that something small, be it Gaza, Lebanon, any one of these fronts could easily escalate. And that leads to the second point was, Sven mentioned in passing what he saw was an inevitability of Iran gaining nuclear weapons or nuclear grade potential. I don't think so, or at least I don't think that's how some of the actors involved in the region see it. So I don't think, for starters, the Israelis or some of the Gulf Arabs, and surely the United States, even under a democratic administration, are going to just sit back and watch it happen. And there was reports yesterday in the Israeli press that were leaked from the strike 2 months ago against the Iranian reactor. We see that there's a lot of active efforts afoot through covert means, through cyber, through all sorts of things to nonetheless halt the Iranian move to nuclear capabilities. Now, we can argue or analyze the degree to which the move out of the JCPOA was counterproductive, and I agree. I did not support the decision to leave the JCPOA. That said, the pressure does continue, and I don't think there's automaticity here, even under a Biden administration, that we will see an automatic return to the status quo ante in 2015. I think at least we will see a debate within some of the Democratic Party, those who want to do that, but also those who recognize that some of the handling of the diplomacy leading up to the JCPOA wound up alienating or at least harming some of the relationships between the United States and its traditional allies in the region. And so that's going to be tricky. And at the same time, the United States is I think going to not going to want to give away its leverage too quickly in any Iranian negotiation. I think it's very possible we could see a negotiation regardless of who wins, because I think the economic warfare has had an impact. Again, we can debate the extent to which it's been the cost. And I'd say one of the biggest costs has been in terms of America's alliance network, and particularly its relationship with Europe, which was what Sven spoke about. And so there's clearly been a shift away from multilateralism, away from alliances under the Trump administration, which I think has been a net loss for the United States, which is why we need to see Europe not just as the past, but also the future of America's alliance network. But I think that there is a problem that I wanted to address with Sven in Sven's comments, and it relates very directly to Lebanon. We see Macron emerging or trying to play a role as a former colonial power, as France, and not as Europe. And one of the challenges for the United States is traditionally in conducting diplomacy with Europe, as a former American diplomat working with Europe, is that Europe is not unified. As Kissinger once, famously quipped, what is the phone number for Europe? And so the problem is that Europe, when it comes, it depends on the issue. When it came to the JCPOA, Europe was unified, and even the E3 today is still quite unified, and that's why the United States is quite angry at France and Britain, for that matter, for still continuing to adhere to the JCPOA and not join the arms embargo that's coming up in October. But at the same time, when it comes to other issues like designating Hezbollah, you do not see a unified European front. You see different countries adopting different policies towards Hezbollah, and that's actually an invitation for the United States to exert pressure, because when Europe isn't unified, we're going to push European countries individually to come along to our point of view. And you're seeing it. You're seeing Germany, you're seeing other European countries coming around to a more hardline view towards Hezbollah. And you even see the United States, when it comes to Macron's diplomatic efforts, taking a kind of an ambivalent role, or a cautious wait-and-see role, allowing the French to proceed, but calling out the French very harshly for any perceived going soft on Hezbollah. And I think that's going to continue.
Okay, we're coming near to our time, gentlemen, but I'll just go back to Sven, please, to close out this session. Sven, a nuclear-armed Iran, Robert said the United States would do everything it could possibly do to stop that. Well, not quite that, but he would want it to not see that happen. A nuclear-armed Iran, is that something that you would see as an Armageddon, if you like, in the Middle East?
I would think it would be a major disaster, and I hope I didn't say that it is inevitable that Iran will get it. I just said that that canceling the JCPOA from the American side was a major step back, and actually makes it more likely that Iran will get this weapon. Now, there should be new negotiations, absolutely. If they fail, then it will really turn into a disaster, so we need to put everything in it. On that, I do want to take the opportunity to push back a little bit on the Kissinger quote, and Europe is not unified. Well, in fact, Europe is, of course, a collection of lots of countries. That is the historical truth. And I'm afraid the US and everybody else has to deal with this. At the same time, Europe is doing a lot to work together. And I would say on the JCPOA, which was negotiated, of course, by a lot of major European countries, but with the support of lots of smaller ones, Europe is more united than the United States is with itself. Because it signed it, it agreed on it, and then a little while later it said no. And we still don't know what it will think 3 months from now, because it all depends on next November. So it's the US really that is divided with itself. Now, I don't think it serves any purpose to divide us. We need to be unified all together, because there is one clear threat, and I think even Russia agrees with us. The clear threat is that Iran would get a nuclear weapon, and that would turbocharge its entire proxy policy. That is the main topic that we have right now. And so I think we need to all put in our best efforts to make sure it doesn't happen. And that can be with secret missions and whatever else you can do under the table. But at the end, it needs to be at the table where we negotiate a good deal. But let it be targeted and not to have too many things on it, like Iran's proxy activities, because if we do that, we will never get there, and that would be Armageddon.
Final word to you, Paul Salem. 30 seconds. What do you have to say about Sven's comments there?
Well, I would agree that the path forward should be to re-engage with Iran and to revive the nuclear deal, hopefully reinforced, and to have ongoing negotiations to make it more open-ended. I do think engagement doesn't mean weakness, and I think Iran continues officially to violate international law, particularly in countries like mine, in Lebanon, and other countries in the region, and does not, unlike most other countries in the world, does not accept some very basic principles of international order. I doubt that they will. So I think Iran will remain something of a pariah state. I think it will need to continue to be under pressure, but pressure has to always go along with negotiation. The point of pressure is to get somebody to agree to something. In order to get there, you have to apply pressure, but also have very forward-leaning diplomacy, something that we have not had in this administration.
All right, that closes out our session. Our time is up, gentlemen. Paul, you've been talking to us from Beirut in Lebanon. Robert's close to the White House in Washington, and Sven is in the Netherlands, and Tom Fletcher was in London. So thank you very much indeed for joining us, everybody, for this Free Connected Minds session. Thanks again to the May Shiddiq Foundation for hosting this special event. Thank you. I'll email you guys. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
I enjoyed that. Thank you.